There are stories that find you, dear friends, and there are stories that stay. This is one of the latter kind. I heard it first from a woman who had been present that afternoon in Bath, not as a guest of consequence, not at the main table with its silver and its wedgwood, but at the side table by the window where they had placed her, on purpose, with the particular deliberateness of a hostess who understands that placement is a language, and had chosen her words carefully. She told me years later, when the telling was easier, that she had known the moment she entered Lady Everton's drawing-room what the morning would be. She said she could read a room the way a schoolmaster reads a class. The arrangement told you everything before a word was spoken. The room told her this: she did not belong at the main table. Her name was Miss Harriet Doyle. She was 27 years old. She had been employed for 14 months as governess to Clara Selbourne, the 7-year-old daughter of Julian Selbourne, the Earl of Selbourne, a man of considerable property in Somerset, recently returned from 3 years in Edinburgh following the death of his wife, and the reason that Lady Everton had planned this particular luncheon with particular care, with the good Madeira and the extra arrangement of chrysanthemums and the invitation list that had been revised 3 times before settling into its final form. Miss Doyle had not been on the original list. She had been added as a practical necessity. Lady Everton had not, I suspect, considered the question of where to seat her with any great attention, or rather, and this, dear friends, is the more honest accounting, she had considered it with great attention and arrived at an answer she found entirely satisfactory. There was a side table near the south window. It received the light poorly in October and was separated from the main luncheon arrangement by a distance of some 12 feet and an ornamental screen. It was where Lady Everton's household customarily placed members of staff who could not, practically speaking, be asked to wait in the kitchen, but who were not, socially speaking, to be seated among the guests. Miss Doyle saw it immediately. She assessed it in the way she assessed all things, without visible reaction, with the particular composure of a woman who has had occasion to be assessed herself and has learned that the appropriate response to a small, deliberate cruelty is not a large one. She sat down at the side table. She arranged her skirts. She looked at the window. There was someone already there. An elderly woman of perhaps 74, with white hair and the expression of a person who has been placed at side tables long enough to have arrived at a philosophical position on the subject. She introduced herself as Mrs. Adelaide Finch. She said she had been placed there because, as Lady Everton had explained to her niece within Mrs. Finch's hearing that very morning, she was rather deaf in the right ear and inclined to repeat herself at table. "Are you?" Miss Doyle asked. Mrs. Finch considered this. "Not especially," she said. "What would you like to talk about?" Miss Doyle asked. Mrs. Finch looked at her with the specific surprise of a person who has stopped expecting to be asked that question. They began to talk. Mrs. Finch had been the wife of a schoolmaster in Gloucestershire for 41 years. She had opinions about the new teaching methods coming out of Edinburgh, about the condition of the lending library in Milsom Street, and about the chrysanthemum arrangements, which she found excessive. She had, it emerged, known Miss Doyle's father, a schoolmaster of some reputation in the same county, and received the news of his death 2 years prior with genuine sorrow. He was a good man, she said. He believed in things. He did, Miss Doyle said. It served him well in most respects. And in others. In others, Miss Doyle said. It left him less prepared for the practical consequences of those beliefs than he might have been. She said it without bitterness, with the even plainness of a woman who has made her peace with the difference between what a good man intends and what the world provides. He believed his daughter would be settled before any arrangement was required. He was not wrong to believe it. He was simply unable to ensure it before he died. "And so you arranged yourself," Mrs. Finch said. "I did," Miss Doyle said. "Missy." Mrs. Finch nodded, with the deliberateness of woman who is no volna for offer to recognize when thing has been managed well and when it has cost the person who managed it more than the managing should have required. At the main table, the luncheon had reached its second course. Lord Selbourne sat at Lady Everton's right hand, which was the position of most consequence in the room, and had been arranged with the particular care of a woman who has been managing social situations for 30 years. He was 36 years old. He had, in the 14 months since Miss Doyle had joined his household, given her every professional consideration and very little personal attention, which was, she had understood, the correct arrangement. He was the Earl of Selbourne. She was his daughter's governess. The distance between these two facts was not a small one, and she had been careful, from the first week, not to reduce it. He sat at Lady Everton's right hand and wore the expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation with correct attention and absolutely no investment whatsoever. He had accepted the invitation because Lady Everton was his late wife's connection, and it would have been unkind to refuse. He was not unkind. He was also, beneath the social correctness, bored in the comprehensive and weary way of a man who finds that most rooms perform at him rather than with him. He was not, at the beginning of the second course, looking at the side table. Then he was. He had noticed Miss Doyle when she entered, in the peripheral way, in which one notices any new presence in a room. He had noticed her direction, Lady Everton's gesture, brief and practiced, toward the window. He had noticed, with the slow attention of a man who finds himself with nothing better to do, that she had gone where she was directed, without pause, without stiffening, without the performance of dignity that would have made the moment about her. She had simply sat down. And then she had turned to the old woman beside her with the full attention of someone who has found, at the wrong table, a conversation worth having. He watched Mrs. Finch's expression change. He had known Mrs. Finch for 11 years. He had not seen her speak with that particular animation at a Bath luncheon in some time. He reached for his wine. He thought, "This afternoon is more interesting than I had accounted for." The luncheon continued in the way of luncheons arranged around a person of consequence. Lady Everton managed the conversation at the head with the efficiency of long practice, directing the table's attention toward Lord Selbourne with the competence of a woman who has been doing this for 3 decades. The conversation was correct. It was also, on Lord Selbourne's side, managed at one remove, the specific social distance of a man attending with half his attention while the other half was somewhere the room had not arranged for it. He was watching Miss Doyle listen to Mrs. Finch. He was watching the careful way she gave the old woman her full attention, the tilt of her head, the small questions she asked at intervals that kept Mrs. Finch talking. And he was thinking, in the particular and inconvenient way of a man who had not expected to be thinking about anything, that in 14 months he had been correct to keep the professional distance, and that the professional distance had perhaps prevented him from noticing things he ought to have noticed sooner. The children had been arranged at a separate table in the adjoining room, under the supervision of one of Lady Everton's parlour maids. Clara Selbourne had gone quietly. She went most places quietly, which was one of the things about his daughter that worried Lord Selbourne in a way he had not yet found the words for. She had been quiet since her mother died. The quietness was not unhappiness exactly. It was the quietness of a child who has decided that making herself small is the surest way of managing a world that has, on one very significant occasion, turned out to be unpredictable. Miss Doyle had told him this 3 months ago, in the brief professional way she reported on Clara's progress each week. She had said, "Lady Clara is not unhappy, she is careful." "There is a difference, my lord, and I think it worth noting." He had noted it. He had not known at the time what to do with the noting. It was during the 3rd remove that the trouble in the adjoining room reached the main luncheon. Clara came through the door. Not running. Clara Selbourne did not run in public spaces. She had been too thoroughly taught. but walking with the specific rapid deliberateness of a child who is working very hard to hold something together and is not entirely succeeding. Her face was the particular stillness of a child who has been crying and has stopped and is now determined not to begin again. She did not go to her father. She went to the side table. She went directly to Miss Doyle, and Miss Doyle opened her arm, and Clara went into it as though it were the most natural arrangement in the room. Because, dear friends, it was. It had been the most natural arrangement in that child's life for 14 months. Miss Doyle said something quietly. Clara said something back. Miss Doyle looked at the child's face with the careful attention she gave all things, said something else, and Clara inhaled, a slow, steadying breath, and nodded. Lord Selbourne, from the main table, had seen all of this. He had also seen what preceded it, Mrs. Drummond's daughter, a girl of 9, with the particular confidence of a child who has never been taught to consider what her words do, saying something to Clara in the adjoining room that Lord Selbourne had not heard, but had read plainly enough in the result. Mrs. Drummond had seen it too. Mrs. Drummond was a woman of the sort who delivers unpleasantness in the manner of a person providing factual information. She turned from her conversation at the main table and said, toward the side table toward Miss Doyle, with the carrying ease of a woman who knows perfectly well that her voice carries, that she hoped the governess was not encouraging Lady Clara to make a habit of retreating at the first social difficulty, as children of that age needed to learn to manage themselves, and that perhaps the methods employed in Lord Selbourne's household were somewhat more indulgent than the situation required. She smiled as she said it. She said it the way people say things they know to be unkind, but have decided to deliver as counsel. She looked at Miss Doyle down the length of the room. Though I suppose, she added, what one can expect from a schoolmaster's daughter teaching a nobleman's child is rather limited. The room produced a silence. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a room that has heard something unkind, said with precision, and is waiting to see what happens next. Miss Doyle did not flush. She did not look at the floor. She looked at Mrs. Drummond with the level attention she gave everything, and said, in the clear and even voice of a woman who has been saying true things from difficult positions for some time, Lady Clara encountered an unkindness in the next room. She managed it with considerable composure. I am inclined to think that is precisely the kind of management that is required, Mrs. Drummond, and the methods that produced it are not ones I intend to revise on the strength of this afternoon's assessment. She paused. With respect. The silence that followed was a different kind. The room was deciding. Mrs. Drummond produced the smile of a woman recalibrating and said, with the specific pleasantness of a person who wasn't finished, how very interesting. The hired help has opinions. There are 3 silences, dear friends, and I want you to understand them. The first is the silence of people hearing something unkind said aloud. The second is the silence of people receiving a correction. The third is the silence of a room deciding which way to fall. This was the third. And into that silence Lord Selbourne stood up. He did not say anything. He did not make a speech. He did not deliver a declaration. Those of you who have been listening long enough to know how I tell stories will understand. The men I choose are not the men who make speeches. They are the men who do the thing that requires no speech at all. He stood. He lifted his chair from Lady Everton's right hand, from the position of most consequence in the room, and he carried it, in the manner of a man who has assessed a situation and arrived at the only adequate response, across the room, past the ornamental screen, and he set it down beside Miss Doyle's chair at the side table. He sat in it. Lady Everton had gone entirely still. Lord Selbourne looked at Clara, whose face had done something complicated, and then arrived at something simpler. The expression of a child who has been afraid for a long time and has just encountered evidence that the world is, in fact, being managed. He said to his daughter, I understand you were managing something difficult. Yes, Papa, Clara said. Did you manage it? Clara considered. She looked at Miss Doyle. She looked at her father. Miss Doyle helped, she said. Miss Doyle, Lord Selbourne said, is very good at that. He looked at Mrs. Finch, who had been observing all of this, with the expression of a woman who has attended a great many Bath luncheons and has not, until this one, found them particularly remarkable. He said, Mrs. Finch, I was told you knew my father. I have been hoping to find the opportunity to speak with you about him all afternoon. Mrs. Finch looked at him. She looked at Miss Doyle. She produced the expression of a woman who has been underestimated for some years and finds the present moment a very pleasant revision of her expectations. I did know him, she said. He was a man who knew where he ought to sit. Dear friends, the luncheon continued. It continued differently than it had begun. The room rearranged itself around the new geometry. Lord Selbourne at the side table, with the governess and the old woman and the small girl. And this rearrangement required the rest of the company to decide, quietly and without any direct acknowledgement, that the side table was now, in fact, where the afternoon's real attention belonged. Mrs. Drummond was gracious. She was gracious in the specific way of a woman who has made a miscalculation and is now engaged in the work of appearing not to have noticed. Lady Everton would, Miss Doyle understood, require the remainder of the week to process the geometry. Miss Doyle sat at the side table and spoke with Mrs. Finch and spoke with Miss about the Milsom Street Library and the teaching methods of the Edinburgh schools, and Lord Selbourne asked questions with the interest of a man who has been attending social obligations for 3 hours and has just now encountered something worth attending to. He was good with Mrs. Finch. He was patient and specific, and he asked the kind of questions that show you have been listening. And Mrs. Finch, who had not been listened to at a luncheon in some time, responded with the warmth of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this. Clara, beside Miss Doyle, ate the remainder of her luncheon and said very little, but there was something in the way she sat. Something less careful, something slightly less small, that Miss Doyle had not seen before that afternoon, and which made something pull, in the specific and inconvenient way of things that arrive without asking, somewhere in the vicinity of her chest. She did not look at Lord Selbourne. She was not, she found, entirely successful. After the luncheon in the entrance hall, there was the business of coats and carriages and social restoration of an afternoon that had been briefly and significantly rearranged. Lord Selbourne had been drawn back into the correct conduct of departure. The thanks to Lady Everton, the pleasantries with the company, the management of the afternoon's remainder with the particular correctness of a man who has done what he came to do and intends to finish properly. Miss Doyle collected Clara's things from the parlour maid and was occupied with the buttons of Clara's coat when she became aware of Lord Selbourne standing beside her. Not at the main company, not with Lady Everton. Beside her, in the particular and deliberate way of a man who has moved through a room to be in a specific location. Miss Doyle, he said. She looked up. My lord, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that was not a small thing you did. She considered. It was a true thing, she said. I find I cannot leave true things unsaid when the unsaying would hurt someone who does not deserve it. He looked at her. I have noticed, he said, that you have been doing that since you arrived. She was still. 14 months, he said. You have been doing it quietly, without requiring any acknowledgement, without any position from which to do it. You do it because it is, as you say, the true thing, and then you go back to being the governess. She did not know what to say. She said, It is what I am. In this house, he said, yes. He looked at her with the quality of attention she had been trying not to allow herself to name. I find I am not content to leave it at that. Clara had finished her buttons. She took Miss Doyle's hand with the easy certainty of a child who does not question that this is where her hand belongs. And Miss Doyle, who had been careful for 14 months, felt the particular careful when the thing you're few and being careful about is looking at you with the full attention of a man who has made a decision. He said, "May I call tomorrow?" She knew what this meant. She knew with the clarity she brought to all calculations the complications it would introduce. She said them plainly because she had not come this far by managing her honesty. "I am the governess," she said. "Lady Everton will note the call, the household will note it. It will not complicate things for you, my lord. It will complicate them for me." "I know," he said. "And you intend to call regardless." "I intend," he said, "to call because I should have called 3 months ago when you told me the difference between a child who is unhappy and a child who is careful, and I understood you perfectly and did not know what to do with the understanding. And because this afternoon you sat at the wrong table for 2 hours and gave Mrs. Finch the best conversation she has had at a Bath luncheon in years. And you corrected a woman who deserved correcting from a position from which most people would not have dared to speak." He paused, "And because I moved my chair and found that it was the first thing I have done in some time that felt entirely correct." She looked at him. She thought he moved his chair. She thought, "Do not make it larger than it is." She found, not entirely successful. She said, 10 o'clock Clara has her French lesson at noon." He said, 10 o'clock. He called at 10. He called again the following Thursday. He sent, the week after, a volume of Scottish poetry he had mentioned in passing, with a note that was direct and short, and said exactly what it intended to say, that the edition contained a preface by an Edinburgh schoolmaster she might recognize by name, and that he had thought of her when he read it. He came to the schoolroom on a Tuesday afternoon in November and asked Clara to show him the project she had been working on with Miss Doyle, which was a record of the leaves collected from the Selbourne estate gardens, pressed and labelled in Clara's own careful hand. He sat in the child-sized chair beside the work table and asked questions about each leaf as though he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Clara talked about the oak leaves and the copper beech and the particular difficulty of pressing sweet chestnut without losing the colour, and was, for 20 minutes, simply a child who knew things and was being listened to. Miss Doyle stood at the schoolroom door and watched. She thought he did not have to do that. She thought he does most things he does not have to do. The household rearranged itself around the clarity of his attentions, in the way of all households, that follow the lead of the person with most authority in the room. The senior housemaid began producing Miss Doyle's tea tray with the better china. The footman developed an urgent and consistent availability whenever Miss Doyle required anything at all. The cook asked, once, through an intermediary, whether Miss Doyle had any particular preferences for the Thursday luncheon. She did not ask who was coming for Thursday luncheon, she knew. It was on a Tuesday in late November, not a scheduled call, which meant it was not a social visit, but something else entirely, that Lord Selbourne came at 11 in the morning and asked to speak with Miss Doyle in the drawing-room. He came in. He sat not in the formal chair, but in the chair beside the window, which was closer than the room's conventional arrangement would have placed him. He did not seem to notice this as an irregularity. She did not mention it. He said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to note before I ask it that I have thought about it carefully, and I am not asking impulsively, and not asking only because of that afternoon in Bath, though that afternoon clarified something I had not admitted to myself." She said nothing. She waited. He said, "I am asking because for 14 months I have had in my house a woman who understood my daughter better than I did, and told me so plainly, and was correct, who gave Mrs. Finch the first real conversation that woman has had in years at a table where she had been placed as an afterthought, who told Mrs. Drummond a true thing from the wrong side of an ornamental screen because she found she could not leave it unsaid." He looked at her, and who has been, in all of that time, entirely professional and appropriately careful, in the exact way her position required, and who I find I am no longer content to watch, be careful from the other side of a professional distance. Miss Doyle looked at him. She thought about Mrs. Finch and the lending library. She thought about Clara's hand in hers at the entrance hall. She thought about the leaf collection and the child-sized chair and the note about the Edinburgh schoolmaster's preface. She thought about the afternoon in Bath when the room went quiet, and Lord Selbourne stood up from Lady Everton's right hand and carried his chair across the floor. He moved his chair. She had been carrying that sentence since October. She said, "You should know that I will not be managed." He said, "I had surmised as much, and that I have opinions about the running of a household and the education of children and any number of other things that you may not always share. I find," he said, "that I would like very much to hear them, all of them, over a considerable period of time." She looked at him with the warmth she had stopped managing 3 weeks ago. "My father is not living," she said. "He died 2 years ago. There is no one whose permission you require except mine." He said, "Then I am asking yours." She said yes. Not with ceremony, not with performance, but with the particular straightforward honesty of a woman who has been sensible her entire life and has found, in the inconvenient and irreversible way of things that arrive without asking, that she cannot be sensible about this man. She had tried. She had been the governess and kept the professional distance, and gone to the side table without visible protest, and done the work that was true and necessary. He had moved his chair, not her, him, and that was the thing she could not get past. She had eventually stopped trying. He came to Clara first before the arrangements, before any of the practical questions that would follow. He came to the schoolroom and told his daughter plainly and directly that he intended to marry Miss Doyle, if Miss Doyle agreed, and that this would change certain things and not change others, and he wanted Clara to know before anyone else in the household. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will Miss Doyle still be here for the leaf collection in spring?" Lord Selbourne said yes. Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "Will she still be my governess?" Lord Selbourne said, "She will be more than your governess, Clara." Clara thought about this carefully. "Can she be both?" she said. Lord Selbourne looked, for the first time in this telling, like a man who was not entirely in control of his expression. He said, with a warmth that was perhaps the most unguarded thing he had produced in some years, "We can ask her." They did ask her. Miss Doyle said she would be both, for as long as the leaf collection required it, which she expected would be some years yet. Clara appeared to find this answer entirely satisfactory, and tucked her hand into Miss Doyle's in the easy way she had, and the three of them stood in the November schoolroom light, and the arrangement seemed, to everyone present, entirely correct. Now, dear friends, I am aware that there are those of you who will want to know what became of Mrs. Drummond. She made her own rearrangements, as people do when the room changes around them, and was gracious about the marriage when it was announced, in the specific way of a woman managing a recalculation with whatever dignity remained available to her. Lady Everton sent a very correct letter of congratulation. Mrs. Adelaide Finch sent a letter that was considerably less correct and considerably more warm, and signed it from the Milsom Street Lending Library, which she had apparently taken to visiting on Tuesdays, and which had, she noted, recently acquired several new volumes of Scottish poetry. Miss Doyle, Lady Selbourne, as she became on a quiet Thursday morning in January, in a ceremony attended by the household and Mrs. Finch and one elderly solicitor who was observed to be visibly moved, though he denied this afterward, kept that letter. She kept it alongside the leaf collection, in the schoolroom that was hers and Clara's, for as long as the leaves kept falling, which, in the gardens at Selbourne, was a very long time. And she kept, though she never spoke of it to anyone but him, the sentence she had been carrying since October. He moved his chair. She was glad of it. She was glad every day that followed. And perhaps that, dear friends, is why stories like this one find us and stay with us, not because a woman was defended, or a room was rearranged, or the correct calculation finally came out right, but because a man who had every reason to remain at the head of the table chose not to, because he stood up and carried his chair across the room to where a woman had been placed deliberately, on purpose in the position that was meant to diminish her. And he sat beside her. And in doing so, without a word, without a declaration, with nothing but the weight of a deliberate and unhurried movement, he told everyone in that room exactly what he believed. She had sat at the wrong table and given a forgotten woman her full attention and spoken the true thing from the wrong position, because she could not leave it unsaid. He had noticed, he had moved his chair. Sometimes that is the whole of it. Sometimes love is as simple and as difficult as that. One person placed where she should not be, and another deciding, quietly and without fanfare, that the correct response is not to stay where he has been put. If that is the kind of story you like, and I have a feeling it is, which is why you are still here, then you are exactly where you belong. Stay a while. There are more like this one waiting, and I am very glad of your company.